Hey, what's up, Touch MBA family? It's Darren. I am still alive. I promise. I know it's been a while since we've recorded our last podcast. Obviously, it's been a difficult time for many of us, but no, yes, we will still be recording episodes. In fact, I plan to put together an episode about COVID-19 and how business schools and applicants and students are responding to that. So I know that is forefront on many of your minds. So we'll definitely record some episodes about that. But this week, I just had a lovely conversation with Graciela Brewer, who applied for business school last fall. She managed to get into 4 top-ranked schools, including HBS, where she will be going. We just had a really, like I said, lovely conversation about her journey coming from user design background, working for a company not as well known in Kansas City, not having that network of friends or colleagues already in business school, and also being a mother. How she went about figuring out which of these programs could really help her career, made the most sense for her family. And a constant theme through this talk was how she made use of every space in the application. And you'll see how she did that and how she went about crafting her story to capture the attention of readers and, show how she could contribute to the class and her unique perspective. Grace was super open about her journey, and it was a lot of fun to have this conversation. Please enjoy a talk, and you can get free school selection help at touchmba.com, as Grace did last fall. We'd try to help you out the best we can, give you an idea of how you can bolster your profile before you apply, and just give an outside view of your candidacy that we hope will help you put together a strong application. You could find all of that at touchmba.com, and let's get to my talk with Grace. Here we go. So in October last year, we received a profile at touchmba.com, and this applicant wrote in her notes, "Not being from this world, I'm constantly going back and forth debating if I even have a sliver of a shot applying to these schools." And it's my pleasure now to introduce Graciela Brewer, or Grace, who came to Touch MBA for help, and she just sent me this amazing news that she just got into Cornell Tech MBA, NYU Stern MBA, MIT Sloan MBA, and HBS. So what an amazing result and accomplishment. Grace, thank you so much for coming on the Touch MBA podcast to share your journey.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, now I'm blushing a little bit after that introduction, but I'm really excited that I've gotten the good news now so that I actually can come on the podcast.
Yeah. And, when you came to our site, we were like, yeah, we think your schools are stretches. It just shows that we're not perfect. We're not, we try to help applicants the best we can with their profiles. And I know, let's get this out of the way. You raised your GMAT to the school averages, right, that you're applying to. But still, despite all that, we probably would have considered your schools as stretch targets, but you killed it. I mean, you did so amazingly well. And I can't wait to dive into your journey and learn more. But I also want to mention what also makes you so distinguished for our show is I believe you're also the first mom applicant to be on the Touch MBA podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I'm proud to be, a mom applicant. There's not too many of us out there, but I was able to find some just in the research during my own journey. But that was something that did play into my applications as well. So I think it ended up being a bit of a strength in my profile overall.
Oh, absolutely. And I can't wait to dive into that as well. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Well, first, where have you decided to go out of those 4 amazing programs?
So right now I have committed to Harvard, so HBS, Harvard Business School, which is still crazy to say, but very exciting.
I'm so excited for you. And what is going on with, COVID-19 now? How is that affecting the process for you as someone who's about to matriculate?
Yeah, so I mean, even before I was done with the application process, it was already affecting me. Like some of my interviews actually moved to virtual. The
Mm-hmm.
week that I went for my Harvard interview, I think was probably the last week they had people on campus and they were no longer shaking hands. They had adopted, as they called it, a smile and nod policy. So, it was already kind of starting during that process. And then, for anyone who hasn't heard, pretty much most business schools are going virtual or already have been virtual since about spring break, and that is the case for HBS. But yeah, so there's just within the admitted students channels for HBS and, for really any of the schools that I applied to, there's just a lot of chatter of, okay, are we going to be virtual next year? What does that mean? Do we get tuition reduction if that's the case? Can we defer? What's going on? And just this past week, we got a pretty shocking email from HBS where they were talking about the fact that they are going to be letting people defer for a 2-week period. I believe the end of the 2-week period is June 1st, but it's still very much up in the air. We have a webinar to learn more, but so we're not sure if it's anyone can defer, if it's applications, or what that really means. But that's a very big move considering no business school has really talked of deferrals too much yet, other than a little bit of a soundbite here or there about the international implications as far as the visa process. So, it's got a lot of us spinning as far as what that really means. If our circumstances are going to allow us to defer, if it does, do we want to? What does that mean for career-wise, timeline, all of those sorts of things?
Yeah. Yeah. And so just, for record's sake, it's April 27th, 2020 right now. So that those decisions will have to be made in less than a month. And just when you thought you had it all figured out and you went through this whole application process, and now you have another big decision to make. Yeah, that is something we will stay up to date on at Touch MBA and try to get, a lot of different perspectives on how that's affecting the schools and students and applicants. Let's go back to the start of your journey, Grace. How did being a mom factor in to your applications and your school research process? I'd like to start there.
Yeah, so as far as school selection, it was something that I had to consider. I think it affected geographically where I was applying because I knew that I was going to be relocating my 5-year-old son and my husband with me, so I didn't want to apply to every school in all different states. So that's why I only applied to schools in New York City and Boston, just because those were schools that as a family we'd kind of decided we were okay relocating to those places. So, I think that's a factor is, probably if you are having a bigger move like that, you don't want to apply to something in California and Texas and, just all over the US. But I did do a lot of research trying to find families on the different campuses. And so a lot of schools do have family clubs. So at Harvard, it's the Crimson Parents Club. And they also, at Harvard specifically, have a Mom BAs Club, which I think was really helpful. And even if you can't get a hold of a parents club specifically, even if you go to a partners club, then you might be able to find, through the partners and things like that, somebody who is a parent there. And I do think that it's important being a mom applicant specifically to try and talk to other moms who are also students, because there is a bit of a difference. And I talked with a current student who is a mom about it, and she was saying, not to say that it's not equally hard for fathers in school, but a lot of times if a male is a student and he's going to school, it's more common for their partner to stay at home versus if you are a female student and you're a parent, then a lot of times the other partner will still be working. And so that's just a different dynamic and a different thing to consider financially and then also just as far as your class load and your workload and things like that. So I really enjoyed getting to have honest conversations with other moms. I think that I asked the toughest questions in my school research process whenever I was talking to other parents, because that was obviously something really important. So, through that, I actually was able to find out more about Harvard's maternity leave policy that they had just enacted. It's oh, well, that's something that's really important to know about. So, I think having those conversations definitely influenced me. But then also when I was on campus, being able to kind of see which campuses had more families around and things like that, or which were maybe I could picture my family being able to run around that campus a little bit more. Where did I see the most strollers and things like that? That was also a factor. But I do understand not everybody can visit campus during the school selection process.
Yeah. And going forward, yeah, I wonder how that's really going to change. But how were you able to get a hold of, all these people at the different schools, right? All these different mothers or parents.
Yeah, so I just reached out to the clubs because a lot of times the clubs will have their own web pages, or even if they don't have like a full web page, they'll have a contact form. And I'll be honest, there were some clubs I had to send more than one inquiry to, because when we'll get into this later, I'm sure I wasn't somebody who knew anyone personally at any of these schools, or any alumni of any of these schools. So I was relying solely on just being able to fill out some of these inquiries or reaching out to people. And I did have one instance where I was talking to a current student who wasn't a mom, but then it came up and she was like, oh my God, I'll send you an email to this person who is a mom and she can talk to you, which was also, a great connection to make.
Yeah. Fantastic. And so you guys made the decision as a family to say, okay, I'm thinking about New York or Boston. Like these are the two places that make the most sense for all of us. Is that accurate?
Yeah, definitely. So my husband's work, which currently is still my work too. We work at the same place, but obviously wouldn't be the case. Yeah, wouldn't be the case whenever I start as a student. But our work had an office in New York, so we were like, okay, so that kind of makes sense. I've always loved New York City. He really loves New York City. We're both city people, but neither of us had actually been to Boston. But, through the research process, realizing, okay, Harvard's there, MIT's there, there's really great schools there. And so whenever we went to Boston, it was both of our first times there. When we were visiting the campuses, we'd both never been there. So it was really kind of a trial run of like, okay, are we good with this place? Could we see ourselves here? And like I said, with both of us loving New York, we went straight from New York to Boston, and we were just in our heads kind of like, we're just going to come here and it's going to be like smaller than New York. It's not going to be as exciting. But, for us personally, we just realized like, oh, Boston is a totally different vibe. Like it's a really cool place. It's nothing like New York, really. It's just like has its own culture, but we really like that. We liked seeing all of the different families who were, jogging along the Charles River and stuff like that. Like we could totally see ourselves there. So
that's beautiful. Yeah. And okay, and then for you, walking through what you were doing before you even thought about applying for an MBA, could you, let our audience know the work you were doing and what kind of inspired you or made you think about MBA programs at all?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not the person that you could look at their resume and understand why they were going for an MBA. So it probably is necessary for me to expand a little bit more. Yeah, so I am what you would call a little bit of a late bloomer professionally. And what I mean by that is I just kind of went into college not being 100% sure what I wanted to do. I actually ended up switching colleges halfway through. I started at the University of Missouri in Columbia in journalism and ended up switching to Missouri University of Science and Technology in something more like computer science related, which obviously, as you can see, are not closely related things at all. And then from there, I ended up getting an internship at my current company as just a software engineer. And while I was interning, I learned that they were starting a user experience team. And so for me, that immediately caught my eye because I am always somebody who has been kind of analytical, but also creative. And so whenever I got my full-time offer, I asked to join that team instead because I felt like it would be a good fit. And so once I started full-time in that role, which is the role that I've been in for the past 4 years, is user experience design at my current company, which is a Midwest healthcare IT company based in Kansas City. Basically, I fell in love with what I was doing. I love user experience. I think it's so exciting. I love the problem solving. I love the creativity. Like I love being able to be a really strong communicator to communicate brand new ideas to people who've never thought of these ideas before as far as how software can function and how it can work. And especially in healthcare where it's very meaningful, you feel like you're really helping people, being an advocate for, different people in the healthcare field. And something that I noticed along that journey, especially living in the Midwest, is that it's really common for UX teams to just be very under-resourced. It's a newer field. And so a lot of times you kind of hear this common refrain in the UX community of like, yeah, we really want a seat at the table. We want to be part of leadership. We want to, have more than a 3-person team whenever there's, hundreds of engineers and we're 3 people trying to keep all of the quote unquote UX in the company just on par. And so I was really just seeing this disconnect of UX just not really being valued enough in the company. And knowing when you have companies like Apple and others out there when design is part of the business strategy, it can have a huge impact. I was like, why is this disconnect happening? Like, why can companies not like fully understand how they can integrate design to make a bigger impact for, what they're doing, both for their users and financially? And so I just kind of got to this point where I realized, if I want to get to that leadership position, I need to understand the business side of things, and I need to understand like what our designs are, and I can see how happy a user is when they see our designs. But what does that mean for the bottom line? And how can I communicate that to somebody higher up in the company so that they do make that investment in UX? And so for me, it made perfect sense. And so it was really just the task of, in my applications, making sure I conveyed that story, since just seeing Midwest Healthcare IT user experience designer on a resume, as I said, is not going to make it immediately clear why I'm applying to Harvard.
And that pretty much, it sounds like that was the career goal, or, in sort of your statement of purpose, that was your story, right? Like that's what you want to do after.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to be in that, leadership role where I can help a company figure out how they want design to work in the company and how they can make that more impactful.
Yes. I mean, did you get into the details of what industry you want to be in, or? I'm just curious how detailed you were in terms of painting the picture of what you wanted to do post MBA.
Yeah, so I think that's different for every school. I think, for me, research was so important to understand how every school treats their essays a little bit differently. Some schools, you get really into the details of their program. I think NYU and MIT were both ones where you were trying to get more into the details of their program, which I found out after the fact that I think that stems from NYU typically being like, oh, people who got rejected from Columbia are just using us as their safety. And then MIT being the same thing with Harvard, which I don't know if that's true. I just heard that anecdotally. But I think that might be more why they're wanting people to dig into the details of their program specifically. But, so for those ones, I did get a little bit more focused on their program and a little bit more focused on my career goals of, this is the, the kind of company I want to work for after this. But, HBS, their essay is much more general, much more broad. And in that one, I really did not get into the specifics of my career goals. I talked more about like my journey from finding kind of my voice, finding UX, and then what I want to do with that in broad strokes, and just kind of as a leader going forward. So, yeah,
it was fun for me to go through all the questions for each of your 4 schools, because I wanted to ask you more about those. But before we get there, what about, like, how did you decide, right, on these 4 programs? I mean, aside from location, which we've obviously talked about.
Yeah, so at first I was just targeting New York because, like I said, we knew that could be a little bit smoother of a transition because of, the office there. And so for me, when I thought of New York, I thought of NYU. Like, I'd been to their campus, like not like fully in their campus, but, having spent time in New York, like walked through their campus, and it's, very beautiful. It's very much kind of quintessential New York vibe. And so I started there, and I really liked their experiential programs. I was really drawn to those. And I did also look at Columbia, and I can't really put my finger on it. There was just something from their website I just didn't really connect with. And I just kind of realized, every application you put in is so much time and it's money in more ways than one. So I was just like, if I'm really not sold on this program, I don't want to apply to it. And then I found out about Cornell's Tech MBA, which is a relatively new program. And I also like the experiential learning components of that as well. And also it being a 1-year program, I wasn't really sure what was going to be more feasible as far as relocating my family. So I wanted to have a little bit more options there as far as, putting a 1-year program in the mix if that was going to be something that was easier for us versus a 2-year. So, from there, I kind of was just looking in general other Northeast ones, and this is so embarrassing. I didn't really know that Harvard and MIT were right next to each other and that they were so close to Boston. I've just never spent that much time in the Northeast because I was just thinking more of like Cornell or Yale as far as like, they're like in these picturesque, like smaller, Northeastern towns. I didn't realize Cambridge was right next to Boston. But then when I realized that it was a metro where my husband could also get a job, I started looking into those programs. And once again, MIT, very big into action learning, really loved that. And then HBS is kind of the odd one out. And I honestly was feeling a bit apprehensive about the case method until I went to a class. And then, yeah, this is a common refrain, I feel like, for people who end up going to HBS. It's like, oh, I went to a class and I saw how dynamic it was. But I really did love that. I loved the way that they were approaching it and just how interested I was in the class that I went to, which was the case was about like petroleum, which is not something I'm interested in at all. But then I realized with the case method, I was still just like so engaged and I cared about all of the different perspectives in the class and stuff. So that's what I would say is like the defining thread was there was a lot of experiential learning for the other three. And then HBS kind of is just like a whole other experience that I found myself drawn to as well.
No, and absolutely. And I know it sounds like you've done so much work on the ground, right? Like reaching out to people, talking to them, reaching out to students, talking to them, visiting campuses. And you did mention in, your email to me that it was really hard for you to find advice and input from MBA students or alums who were coming from the type of background you had that we've discussed, right? Like, I'm wondering for other listeners who might have that same problem, like, is the only way to kind of it sounds like you just did a ton of research and reaching out. Or, looking back at your application process, was there certain activities that you feel were higher leverage, right? If you're coming from that place, you don't know people at these schools or they're not in your network and you're trying to figure out, where am I going to make this huge investment of my time and money, right? For graduate school. Like, I'd love to hear your perspective there.
I'll start by saying that I really didn't find somebody who is coming from as kind of a non-traditional background as me. So don't let that discourage you. I would start with that. It's, people might have a different perspective just because they are having a different background, but that's still valuable. And that's still something to consider when you're learning about the school and learning about, maybe how you want to phrase your application. So just because you don't find somebody who maybe is similar to you in this process, like, obviously it can still work out. So keep your chin up and keep working at it for sure. But yeah, I think I'd mentioned this before, but reaching out to the clubs, I know some people use LinkedIn to reach out to students, or they'll like contact admissions and ask to be contacted with a student. But I found that going through the clubs is much better because you can connect with people who are going to have a common interest, go to the clubs that you actually want to join when you're there. So for me, that was like the tech club or, like I said, the family club and stuff like that. And that's also helpful because not only will you have a little bit of common ground and you can learn about the resources for those different things, but it's like you can also start thinking about how you might want to contribute to that club when you're a member and things like that, which can be really helpful with your essays. And for me, I was thinking I wanted to go to business school for the academics, which I do, but I also did not even really know about the whole culture of all the other things that business school provides, like the clubs, like networking, like recruiting. And so for me, learning about all of those other things was super important because, one, they just got me more excited about, the next 2 years of my life, but then also it was just important to know all of the things that I was going to need to do once I was there. And once again, you don't need to join a club, but if you want to really take advantage of whether it is the tech club or the entrepreneurship club or whatever it might be, you can learn more about what the really atmosphere is for that sector at the school. And then as far as like just overall advice of like getting up to speed on this process, I think, listening to things like Touch MBA is really helpful. I think just hearing the more perspectives. I just got to this point where I was razor focused on MBA stuff. So I felt like everything I did every day was just focused on that as far as, listening to podcasts about it while I was at work or like reading poets and quants and stuff like that. One tool that I did use that really helped me was something called Applicant Lab. So I didn't know anything about how much money people spend trying to get into business school. So I really didn't know that admissions consulting was this, huge industry that it is. And that, a lot of applicants, especially when they're applying to places like, Harvard and MIT, will spend thousands of dollars on consultants to try and get them there, or, hundreds of dollars for private GMAT tutoring sessions and stuff. And so that was another thing that I found to be pretty intimidating. And Applicant Lab was something that I stumbled on. And basically it's a website and it has a lot of really great admissions advice, and some of it is like more school specific, so you can input the places you're actually applying and then it'll tell you more about like the essay for that school specifically. And that was something I really liked too, because I I'm not like against people using admissions consultants, but for me personally, it wasn't something I felt comfortable doing. I was totally fine just trying to learn more about how admissions work and, getting advice and stuff like that. But I just felt like for me, I didn't really want to cross the line, even if I had the money, which I did not, into, somebody tailoring my essays and somebody telling me exactly how to answer interview questions or how to, do this or that. And I found Applicant Lab to be really good. One, because it's much more affordable. I think I actually wrote down the cost here. It's like $299. Yeah. And that's just like a one-time fee, and then you can just use the site. But then also I just felt like it was something that was nice where it's like, okay, this just kind of can get me a little bit more into the heads of the things they're going to be looking at when they're looking at my application. How can I just be considerate of those things as I write my essays, as I, make my resume, all of those sorts of things. So, I think consuming a lot of that advice and just being well-rounded whenever you're coming from kind of square zero, as I was, can be really helpful when you're trying to form the story of your application.
For sure. And I'll link to Applicant Lab in the show notes. I think they provide an amazing service. Did you read any books, or were there any... Yeah, I'm just curious what other resources you found really helpful.
No, I didn't really read any books, which I don't know. That wasn't an avenue that I was as interested in, just because it seems like different things for each application changes every year, whether it's like, oh, this school added an essay or removed an essay, or they changed the question they're asking or something like that. So I just didn't know if a book would be as up to date. I'm sure there's some good ones out there, but that just wasn't something that I explored. So, it was more about just kind of like reading the different articles, a lot of disparate Google searches of, what do you do if you have this GMAT or you have this score or something like that, just kind of looking at different blogs and all of that along the way.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, Applicant Lab was tremendously useful for you. I mean, was there one thing in terms, or a couple of things that you really learned from working on your application with that program that you think could be helpful for other applicants?
Yeah. So let me think about that for a second.
Like something that maybe you didn't even consider, right? Those are often really good learnings too.
Yeah, so I think something for me that was important that I learned from that, and that I think potentially people with non-traditional backgrounds also need to consider is, not just how can you convey like what you want to do and why you're applying to business school and things like that, but also, can you make sure that an MBA makes sense for that goal and that you can also verify that point? Because for me, going into my interviews and going into my, application long form essays and stuff like that, that was something that I needed to make sure was clear, not just that, okay, cool, you want to be a design leader. Well, you already have some design leadership experience. Why don't you just continue down that road? And, having to make sure that I was being more aware of the fact that I need to make sure that it's clear that I need the business side and that I am going to be able to leverage these resources in a different way than everyone else, and that, that it is necessary. So that was something that I wasn't, I don't think, considering as much until I started using the software. And then I realized how important that is for, it's great to be non-traditional, and that does make you stand out in the applicant pool, but you do still have to vie for, okay, but here's why it makes sense for me to be part of the class.
Yeah. And so how could you bolster that case? Like, I have some ideas in my mind, but I'm wondering, like, so what would that involve for you, right? To make that case for, I need the MBA.
Yeah. So for me, part of it was just, my own anecdotes from being at work and things like that. And, like I said, just being able to say, like, I've been on this project and I've been able to see people firsthand, groups of people, and I've redesigned products and seen the way that they view our company has completely transformed. And that's been amazing and it's been impactful. And that's something I can relay to others. But I personally do not have any idea how that influences our financial numbers or how we need to be measuring that more effectively, from a business analytics standpoint. Those are things that I understand are important, but I don't have the background to be able to speak to them or know how to implement them. So just being able to come up with specific examples. And for me, especially going into my interviews, I had I think 3 different examples or so like that just lined up. Another one that I talk about a lot is, okay, I need to understand how companies actually create a business strategy so I can even figure out how design fits into that, because I don't know the questions they're asking when they're coming up with a business strategy and what that entails. So if I can start there, then I can figure out and get to the next step of helping them use design as part of the execution of a strategy and stuff like that. So
Yeah. And did you apply to all your schools in one round, or how did you spread that out?
Yeah, so I applied to all of my schools round two. The Cornell Tech round two was significantly earlier just because they start in May. So that one was a little bit offset from the others, but the other three were all hitting submit in the month of January, which that wasn't anything super intentional. It was more, I had been considering an MBA just off and on for kind of the past 2 years or so. And then it wasn't until the August of last year that I just decided that I was going to go for it. And I just didn't think that I would be able to get my applications to the point they needed to be in time for round one.
Gotcha.
So.
Gotcha. One thing I want to talk about is, all the other stuff you were doing outside of work, right? So first, let me say, I love your resume, the way it was designed. And I know you made this note. You're like, yeah, I made it. You designed your resumes like similar to the design aesthetic of each school you're applying to, right?
Yes, I did. I didn't even know if they'd notice. Some of them I did have like the logo of the school if it made sense for like the layout of the page, but some of them were more just like kind of the overall style. And I was like, well, I mean, it looks nice anyway. So if they don't notice, it's not a big deal. But if they do, it's a nice little touch. So
I loved it. I mean, it's super clean. And I'm like, this looks so familiar. When I saw that it was designed like the HBS website, I'm like, oh, that's why. Because it's like the same fonts.
Yeah, same
right?
colors. Yep.
Yeah, same colors. I'm like, gosh, this looks so, because I look at the HBR stuff a lot, and so, but yeah, you designed your resume so it's very clear how you progressed, right, at your company, from engineer to senior engineer to lead engineer, UX engineer. You talk about your dedicated causes. I love that, like as opposed to like hobbies or something. Dedicated causes. And then you kind of lay out like your three things you've done, right? Driving user-centered design forward, improving gender and ethnic diversity in the workplace, and building the skills of your team members. I'm wondering how much of those extracurriculars factored into your application, factored into the way you made your case during the interviews, and factored in your discussions and research process.
Yeah, so kind of starting with the resume piece, obviously not everybody needs to go make their resume look like the school. For me, that was just something, having a design background, being a professional designer, I wanted to give a little bit of flair. But I do think in general, like the resume is something that people don't give enough time and effort to. I think it's really easy to just be like, okay, cool. I just have to list out my education, my experience, and then my extracurriculars, and then hit done. I redid my resume a lot because I really wanted it to convey who I was. And, like you said, I was very intentional with how I put my career progression. So above each of my titles, I put a paragraph that provided context. My first title was like user experience designer, but what they didn't know, if you just see that on a piece of paper, is that the UX team was brand new to the company. So I was having to fight a lot of battles and trying to make sure that UX was even recognized. And every project I was having to, kind of work overtime to really prove the value of UX. So that's just one example. But, I kind of put that paragraph of context of the transition of the team over time. But then also I think the benefit of breaking up my bottom section into dedicated causes as opposed to just a list of extracurriculars is I could kind of mix and match as I needed to. So for gender and ethnic diversity, some of the points I put under there, some of it was work related, some of it was extracurricular, some of it was professional organizations I was a part of. And so that was a way where I could kind of move things around so that I think I could fit more in a smaller space, while also conveying just a little bit more about me, because those are three things that I'm really passionate about. I think that people should play around a little bit more with their resumes and figure out the best way to like tell their story. It doesn't necessarily have to be just the typical template. Make sure that it conveys the information it needs to. You don't want to make it hard on the admissions committee to find the information that they need to, but I think you can kind of lay out your story in a way that makes sense for you. But for me, as far as extracurriculars, that really didn't come into the process too much. Like, I think, of course, it was probably good that I had extracurriculars and helped me appear more well rounded. But as far as my interviews, it really was not something I was asked about. I think they were so interested in a lot of the things you're talking about of, oh, why does a UX designer want to go to business school and stuff like that, that most of the time for all of my interviews was focused on that. And then also the fact that I was a college transfer from one major to a very different major also had questions about it. So I just think there were enough other pieces that they wanted to use that time to focus on and get a little bit more explanation around that my extracurriculars really weren't something that I was given a lot of questions about.
The way you put it was perfect in that you don't want to make it hard for the reader to understand what you've done. But yeah, showing clear themes as you did, because it's very clear to me right away from the context you provided with your jobs, a job progression, as well as your dedicated causes, that you're not just a UX designer, but you're, like you said, you're pushing for the growth of UX, not only within your company, but as an industry, and like, you know, like trying to just push UX forward, right? In all ways. And it's very clear how you're doing that, like in your community, right? With certain organizations and stuff like that. Anyways, so now everyone's going to want to see your resume. I want to talk about some of the unique aspects of some of these schools, and I'm wondering, you know, if we could hear your thoughts on those. So I guess first, the Harvard essay, right? I mean, it is the bane of so many applicants' existence. It's super open-ended. It's one broad question. They don't give you any sort of word limits, and they're just like, yeah, don't overthink this, of course. But the question is, you know, what more would you like us to know as we consider your candidacy for HBS? And I think it's really interesting to hear how you didn't want any sort of consulting help, in the sense that, you know, you didn't feel right about it, but you wanted guidance. But in a way, maybe it's good if you don't have like a lot of guidance, because maybe your essay is different in that sense.
Yeah, so for me, kind of how I tackled the essay, and one, I would say, as far as the application process goes, as long as you're clearing the bar with quant, I think being a strong writer is actually probably a better asset to have than being super strong quant. Like, of course, you have to kind of hit the minimum for quant to get into most of these schools. But after that point, you're probably better off being a better writer, because you can make your essays, you know, a little bit more unique. But yeah, as far as the Harvard essay, I rewrote it probably 7 times, just completely different stories. But I did eventually kind of settle into something that I felt like was personal and conveyed what I wanted to. I still had a lot of changes that I made within that version of it. But I felt confident that it was the right story. And so for me, I had kind of a unique take on it. So my full name is Graciela Tempest Aguilarian, my maiden name. Yeah.
That's a mouthful. Yeah, it's like, whoa.
Yeah. And so growing up, I grew up in the military, and I, every classroom I would go into, with it being Aguilarian, my last name, I'd be at the top of the sheet. But it's a very long name and it's a mouthful, and everybody would always mispronounce it. And so I kind of started off of just like my essay being that setting of me being in the classroom and the teacher not knowing my name. But then kind of dove into something a little bit deeper, which is just the fact that like I have always really valued my name, because Graciela is like graceful and calm, but then Tempest is, you know, like a tempest, like a storm. And a lot of the personality traits about me are very contradictory. And so I kind of went into that and used it as a springboard to talk about like my growth as somebody having, you know, like I mentioned to you a little bit earlier, somebody who has analytical interests and creative interests and stuff like that, and kind of what that meant. And I did just a few sentences about that, what that meant for me growing up, but then also kind of went into why I felt like that eventually led me to UX and how much I loved it and how passionate I was about it. And then just going in a paragraph or two of what I was telling you about, you know, how I want to be able to advocate for users, and I want to be able to bring that voice to the boardroom. But, you know, I would say mine was probably half of my essay was pretty personal as far as talking about just my personal journey, things that weren't work related. The second half did get into here's why that matters and tying it into, you know, the work things and my goals in regards to that. As far as me being a mom, that was something that was really important, because a theme in my essay is just the fact that, like I told you, I was a bit of a late bloomer just because I lacked confidence growing up. But whenever I was pregnant with my son, it happened unexpectedly when I was in college. And I basically, in a 4-week time period, I had my son, aced my finals, moved to a new city, and started an internship. And that was the first time that I was like, hey, maybe I can kind of do things that other people can't. Like, maybe I do actually have, some determination and some, things that I can use to make me accomplish more than I thought I could. So, I do think that, like I said, being a mom was kind of something that helped that story and helped, show the defining things along the path for me of who I became. But something very intentional that I did in my HBS essay was I didn't talk about HBS specifically. And so I think, and I know some people who did, so it's not like a line in the sand that you have to do it this way, but HBS knows that HBS is great. So spending a lot of that word count just talking about the things that you're going to do on campus as far as I'm going to join this club and I'm going to do this. And I really love HBS because the case method is so, whatever, so vibrant and so great. They hear those things. They get 10,000 essays a year. They hear those things constantly. So I just felt like if I'm going to take this space to really get a totally open-ended piece of paper where I can say anything I want to about myself, I'm not going to use that to tell them about the thing they already know, which is their own school. So, and then at the end, I kind of just covertly tried to tie those themes into, I have a very different background, but that's why it's actually really good that I didn't just go to a super typical school or a super typical firm, because I think I'm going to bring a different perspective, kind of trying to say that without being super blatant about, I'm going to be great diversity for the case method.
Right. Gosh. Oh, I love that response. Thank you for sharing that. I think that will be so helpful for our listeners, and I can't agree with you more about what you said about wasting essay space or application space, repeating something the school already knows. I mean, the best way, it's exactly what you said. I'll just say it a different way, which is show, don't tell, right? Your story has to fit into what they're looking for, of course, in some way, right? But you don't have to, it's not exactly. I don't need to go any further. I think you said it perfectly.
But I will say, as far as the word count, I did go with kind of just the generally accepted word count, which is, somewhere I think between 700 and 1,500 about was where I read. I think I was right on the top end of that, more near 1,500 or something.
1,500?
So, yeah.
Where do you get those numbers? What?
I did a few different Google searches, and so some of them did err more on the lower side of that, but then I read some other ones from I think one of them was from somebody who'd worked in admissions, and they were like, if you need a little bit more room to tell your story, that won't be used against you. But yeah, so I kind of just tried to ballpark it. I would say 1,000 is probably, a safe zone, but, I didn't want to get too wordy because I have a tendency to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about keeping your reader engaged, right? And if your story is engaging, then they'll be willing to read more words, right? But don't feel like you have to fill out the space. Yeah, exactly.
It's tell what you need to, and also, obviously there's so many pieces of advice out there that say this, but it's you don't need to make your resume just an essay form.
Right.
You don't need to just write a list of accomplishments.
Exactly. Yeah, please don't do that. I love that example you gave. And then what about for the interview? How did that go at HBS? The interview and the post-interview reflection?
Yeah, so at HBS specifically, I was floored how nice they were. Not to say that people at HBS aren't nice. Everyone I've talked to has been super nice, but I do think the things that I read was that sometimes the HBS interview process can be a little bit more stoic, just because they are trying to kind of read you, and so they might not be as, forthcoming with their side of the conversation as far as showing their emotions too much. Was totally not the case for me. And also, I was just really surprised because they have you, when you pick your interview slot, I went to Boston for mine, so I was on campus, and they had the admissions staff there. And so whenever your interview slot came up, there was other people interviewing at the same time. So the admissions staff who aren't interviewers, they would bring you upstairs to the interviewers. But before that, they would actually give you a little pep talk, and they would just kind of pause you in the hallway, and they would say hey guys, you're the next group for the interview, but just know if you're here, that's because we're interested in you. you. Like, this is the hardest part, is getting to hear. Like, please, just let us show who you are. We want to get to know you. Like, they were super friendly and super nice. And I was just like, that's so sweet that they did that. But yeah, then as far as my actual interviewer, she was super nice. It was a very open conversation. I will say some things that I read that is definitely are true is like, know your industry, know your company, which for me, I really lucked out in that because my team is really small. So we have to work across all of the products in the company. And so I have been exposed to that for, just by nature of my role. But yeah, so there was definitely a lot of questions about that. Like, oh, well, what are some problems about your company? Or like, oh, you've grown through acquisition. Has that been a problem? How does that work? Like definitely grilled me a lot about my industry, but then also a lot about, UX, growing UX. I talk about that a ton in my essays. What does that really mean? And I had actually done some research with some numbers, which I think really helped. I was able to say like, yeah, this study of like 2,000 companies, actually, 50% of them were rated a 1 out of 5 in design maturity,
right.
Just
there's a business case. There's a business case for what you need to do, right? In a sense.
Yeah, exactly. So I totally memorized just a bunch of facts and figures beforehand. And I don't think everybody needs to do that. I just think in my case, if anybody was going to really try and push me on like, well, why does a UX designer need to be in business? I was going to be ready.
Yeah. So it sounds like they really want to make sure you're business conversant. And then in the post-interview reflection, like what was your process going through that?
I really tried to not overthink it. I'd kind of heard that it's not necessarily something that's going to make or break you. Like, I wanted to take advantage of the space, but you only have 24 hours anyway. And like, if you're like me, you have a flight in that time, so you don't have a ton of free time to really think about it. But there was one question that she asked me that I realized she'd asked me if an EHR is the same thing as an EMR, and I said yes, and technically there's a slight difference. So I just, used that space to clarify that, because I didn't, want to seem as if I hadn't, like I don't know the difference or whatever. So I did that. I just did and it was just bullet points, because they tell you to format it like an email. So I really just did like oh, hey, great to meet you, blah, 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 and then just bullet points. So I did a bullet point for that, a bullet point for, the ways that I want to give back on campus, because I didn't really talk about that in my interview of just like, yeah, I want to join this club. I hope to, do this thing or this thing. And then, goodness, I can't remember what my last point was. Oh, I think I just talked about like the fact that I think you being part of user-centered design has also helped me as a manager, like as far as being able to read people and prioritize, emotion and the role of work and stuff. So, I just kind of picked 3 things. It was about a page or so, but I just didn't want to get too lengthy with it. I felt like I was like, well, the interview's over. I know that's probably going to be the main thing. I want to use this space usefully, but I don't want to go on and on.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like your journalism background really helped you, like, think through all these things. I mean,
like I said, I think being a good writer is something that's really helpful in this process for sure.
Yeah, right. I want to talk about two or three other elements of the other schools, because I'm sure applicants will have similar questions. So one is let's talk about MIT Sloan, if you don't mind. I think they have a really interesting admissions process, like asking for the cover letter and asking for the video. So I'd like to talk about those 2 things.
Oh my goodness. So if you are somebody who's applying to MIT and HBS, it's just so funny, because you are dealing with complete opposite problems when you're working on those essays, where you have like the most open-ended thing in the world at HBS and you have no word limit. And then you have like this super specific prompt and only 300 words for MIT. So I remember sitting with my husband in our living room one day and like working on one and working on the other. And, it's like, oh God, this one we're trying to shave as many words as we can off of, and this one we're trying to figure out where we need to add words to tell the story. And yeah, it's just like they're both extremely difficult in totally opposite ways.
Right.
Yeah, I think for the MIT one, it's so hard, because it's like your only essay, and even in their application form, they are much more slimmed down than a lot of other schools. Like, they just don't really have a lot of free text boxes for you to even explain much in the application form. So you have like a lot of pressure when you're trying to fill that out. And for me, especially having a little bit more of a complex background and a complex story, it was really difficult for me to get down to it. And I just realized for me, I was going to have to just narrow it to one specific part of my goals. And by that, I mean, sorry. By that, I mean not just talking about how I want to improve user experience in general and all the things I've done in the past, 4 years at my job. Instead, I focused more on like the user research side of it, only the things that I'd done more focused towards improving user research, and just having a few examples there. And then I broke it down into 3 paragraphs. So the first one was kind of my hook, because I think that's still really important, even in, having limited space. I talked about the fact that I have been able to witness things like seeing a foster care worker talking about, children that they've seen come through the system a lot of times. I've seen people suffering in substance abuse recovery clinics and stuff like that. So I talked just a sentence or two, just kind of to bring the reader in as far as those things. And then I tied that into user research as far as being able to, those people are important. How can we make the company better in serving them when we design our software? And then my last paragraph was just a quick sum up. I had to keep it very vague as far as, what you were saying before, how specific did I get with career goals? I kept it pretty vague because I just knew I didn't have the word count and was just kind of talking in pretty general terms as far as what I was wanting to do with the MBA.
Yeah. I mean, their prompt is, I'm reading it like straight on their website, and I'm intimidated just reading it. We are on a quest to find thoughtful leaders with exceptional intellectual abilities and drive and determination to put their stamp on the world. We welcome people who are independent, authentic, and fiercely creative, true doers. We want people who can redefine solutions to conventional problems and strive to preempt unconventional dilemmas with cutting-edge ideas. We demand integrity and respect and passion. So taking that all into account, please submit a cover letter, telling us why you should be a part of this program.
Yeah, in only 300 words.
And I'm like, oh, I love to write, but that's intimidating. Yeah,
it's difficult.
That is frightening. That prompt, and then oh yeah, so why you in 300 words?
Yeah, it's also hard to, for me, if I'm giving an example, I want to give a little bit of more background about that example of okay. So one example is just I was able to convince people in our company to do a design sprint. So it's I want to be able to say when the right project came along, I was able to reach out to the engineering manager and but it's you can't. In that essay, you have to be a little bit more of just here's a quick hit on this accomplishment, and I need to sum it up in a sentence or two just to give you kind of the overall of it. And then if you want to know more, you're going to ask me in the interview.
Exactly. Okay. And then if we could talk about the video statement. First of all, how did you feel about that as part of the application, making a video?
I really didn't mind it. I liked that it was only a minute. If it was something longer than that, or if video editing was part of it, I think it would have been a little bit more intimidating. So the fact that it does encourage you to just kind of talk for a minute uninterrupted and just give a little bit of yourself, I think is helpful. Because if it was something where it's put together a 10-minute video about you and you can video edit and all that other things, I would be out of my depth on that. But yeah, so I didn't mind that part. I liked it. I like it when applications give you a little bit more of a creative outlet like that. I think it's kind of fun. Especially me being kind of a creative person. So it's kind of how can I take on this challenge?
Yeah. So how did you for MIT? Because they asked you to introduce yourself to your future classmates, right? And include a bit on your past experience and why MIT Sloan is the best place for you. Yeah.
So for me, I would definitely recommend kind of coming up with a script, not a word for word script, but just the points that you want to make in that time, because it is a minute and it goes by so fast. You need to know what you're going to say, at least generally, so that you can make the points that you want to make. And so for me, since I didn't include it anywhere else in my application, that's where I talked about what I was telling you of being a mother and that pushing me past my own expectations. And so I kind of just gave that quick anecdote at the beginning, and then kind of tied that into, in that case, I pushed myself further than I thought I could go. And I want to do that same thing in a transition from a UX designer to being a business leader. And then once again, MIT, I think, is one where you need to get a little bit more in depth with the activities and why you really want to go to MIT. And so in that case, I actually talked the last 20 seconds or so. Like I gave a pretty good amount of time of like, oh, well, I really love the enterprise management track. I think that's going to be helpful for that goal. And, I want to join the design club, and, like being able to talk not just like I'm going to join this and this, but like here's why I want to join it and why that makes sense for what I just told you from the first part of the video.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like to me, listening to you talk through various parts of the application, that you almost had a core group of themes and a core group of stories to go along with those themes, and that you're kind of picking the best one to show depending on what the question was or depending on how much space you had. Does that sound accurate, or did you kind of come up with?
No, that's 100% accurate. So I had like a different Google Doc for each school because I knew the things about me that were, like a little bit more hard hitting. Like, like I said, obviously my anecdote about being a mom, or like, some of my work projects that I knew were going to be a little more compelling and stuff like that. And so I really did map everything out of, okay, this application gives me this space and this space and this space. How can I kind of rearrange this to fit that so I can be able to tell all of those things that I know are my strengths versus, another application is going to have totally different layout. And so how do I move that around? And even just something small, like some applications like don't have as much space for you to put anything in the actual form fields about extracurriculars or in college, or, the things like awards or something like that. And so in that case, I just added like a small line in my resume to add those awards. But if then it was a form field or an application form that I could have a totally dedicated text box for that, then I would use that space in my resume for something else, like just being able to kind of flex to figure out the most efficient way to tell that. Because I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got from a current student was, make sure every part of your application tells a different story, like tells a different piece of information. Because especially in the HBS one where they have, those additional form fields for like most significant accomplished, like most difficult challenge or whatever, you don't want to just use that space saying a bullet point that you already put in your resume.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think our listeners might be like, oh, this is so like detailed, but exactly. It's so detailed. Like you're making use of every space you have and not repeating yourself, and like engaging the reader at each of those spaces, right? Like shining a different perspective on you.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's important. Is it's kind of like dating. It's like, well, yeah, you want to put your best foot forward, but at the end of the day, you still want to be you. You know, like if a school is going to see you and not want it, then you probably shouldn't be there. Like you do still want to be authentic.
Absolutely. Okay, one more application question. So I thought Cornell Tech's process was pretty interesting. First of all, trying to answer 6 of their questions in such a limited space for the personal statement. I'm like, it's another impossible task. But we've talked a lot about essays already. So I'm more curious about their case study interview. They have this reputation that they're kind of at the edge, right, of what an MBA program can be and can do. So I'm wondering what the case study interview was like. Like they send you a case study before, right? That interview?
Yeah, so I don't remember if it's 24 or 48 hours before, but it's pretty general. I mean, it's not like a case in the like you're thinking of like a case interview for like a consulting or any role or anything like that. It's more just kind of like a prompt, I think would be a better way to put it. So it's more of just like a paragraph long thing where it puts you in a role of, for me, it was a product manager, but I'm sure if somebody was more financially related, maybe it'd be like, oh, you are a financially related role or something, and kind of just puts forth like an industry and whether or not you should make a decision. But it's not like it specifically says, this isn't based on a real company. This is just something that we want to see the way that you think. And so in that case, it is pretty broad. It's just like I said, a paragraph, and it just gives you a chance to demonstrate the way that you think about a problem. So it's really not supposed to be based on like you really digging into actual data in any way. And it was about the first 10 or a little over 10 minutes of my interview was like going through that. And they did definitely pause and like ask me like, well, why did you do this and not this? It wasn't like anything too crazy, but there were times where they were like, oh, okay, well, why not this way instead? They did do that. And the way that you present it is totally up to you as far as, you can make like a Word doc, or, you can make like a slideshow or something like that. They don't really specify that. For me, I do prototypes of, websites for work. So I just kind of made like a little mock website of it and walked through that for, once again, it themed like the school's website, but just walked through the steps of that.
Nice. Okay. So it doesn't sound too different or too onerous.
Oh yeah, I was a little intimidated because they specifically don't tell you too much about it beforehand. But yeah, no, I think it is just a good chance to, talk about the way you think about things without having to just talk about your resume.
And did you feel like the applicants there did tend to be more tech or entrepreneurial types?
I'm not sure, because that was all of their interviews are conducted over Skype, so I didn't really go and sit with an interview group and stuff like that.
Okay.
So
yeah. And then your recommendations. I have to ask about this because there's 4 schools. There's so many recommendations. Like, how did you select and prepare? Like, did you have one person recommending for all 4 schools?
No, I tried to not make it too hard on any one person.
Great. Yeah.
So let's hear about it. Yeah, I had 3 people that I had write me recommendations, and I think I had, some schools require 1 recommendation, some require 2, all of that sort of thing. And so I kind of spaced it out where I think each person wrote me about 2 recommendations. I also applied through the consortium for NYU, so that I had another recommendation for that. So for me, I had somebody who was pretty much like my mentor through all of my professional career, and also saw me when I was an intern at the company and was leading me at that time as well. So he was kind of like a no-brainer. And I knew that I wanted him to spend a good amount of time on it. And so I didn't ask him to do all of my recommendations. I just asked him to do my recommendations for the more selective schools, because I figured that's where he would be able to have like a really good impact on my application overall. And for that, I did prepare kind of like, oh, hey, here's maybe like things to keep in mind with the recommendations. Because for me, these aren't people who are used to writing MBA recommendations. It's different than just writing a typical recommendation. You can't just, write a lot of adjectives about, this person is excellent and great and hardworking and blah, 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 because in admissions committee, that's not going to really amount to much. So I wrote kind of a guide for each of my recommenders, just talking about like overall things to keep in mind. Like, hey, make sure if you have something you want to say, demonstrate it through examples. Like, don't just, keep it high level, like actually try and show it. Focus more on my leadership qualities rather than just UX hard skills, because that's another difference. If it's a professional recommendation, you might be focusing on just me being like my hard skills in my current job, but this is more leadership focused and stuff. And, just kind of broad strokes of, here's maybe some things I thought that it would be beneficial to talk about, but, ultimately left it up to them and didn't bother them as far as, like, oh, what exactly did you put or how'd you phrase it? I just kind of gave them some overall ideas and then just left it at that and gave them that. But yeah, like I said, I tried to make it so each person didn't have to do a ton of recommendations. I think some people do that. I don't know how people who apply to like 9 schools do it. I don't know if they just have one person or how that works, because that seems crazy to me. I can't even imagine the amount of work that it takes to apply to 9 schools. I would never do that. But especially for the recommender part, it's like, that's not just your work, that's asking work on somebody else. So I don't know how other people balance that, but I just felt super guilty if I was going to ask one person to write 5 recommendations for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation too, because it sounds like, for example, your mentor, I mean, it's a clear referee that you need, and it sounds like the best referee. So I'm sure a lot of people would be like, well, why don't you use him for all 4 or 5 schools that you're applying to, right? So that's an interesting perspective. It's kind of like, all right, we're going to put you in the 4th quarter, or like where it matters most, right? Like the way you kind of did that.
Yeah, and like I said, it might have been totally fine, and I think people in other companies probably just get approached for MBA recommendations more frequently, and it's just totally more acceptable. For me, it made me a little bit uncomfortable. It might have not been a big deal if I asked one person to do all of them, but I just didn't want to be too much of an inconvenience for any single, person in my network.
Yeah, it's also EQ too, and being like, oh, maybe this one referee doesn't have as much time or can't put as much focus into it, so I'll just let that person go, hard at one or two schools, right? Knowing each person's situation. I want to ask you about staying sane through this entire process. And I'm intentionally doing this after we covered so much of your journey. How did you stay sane? Like you have a little boy. He's probably like, Mom, what's Harvard? Like, why are you spending all this time on applications? Your husband, work, everything.
Yeah, so I do have some photos of my son, quote unquote, studying with me. He's like doing his coloring book while I have my GMAT book open. He was like, I want to study with mommy.
Wow.
So advice I have for staying sane is find somebody who loves you unconditionally to talk about all of this crap with, because it's going to be your life for several months, and you're probably going to repeat yourself, and you're probably just going to like be asking the same questions and just talking through things, whether that be, your learnings about a school or your learnings about the admissions process, or you just trying to figure out how you want to phrase your essays, or, it's just on your mind a lot during this time because you're working really hard at it and stuff. And you're probably, like I said, you're going to repeat yourself. So just find somebody who can be like, your ear during that time period and is not going to get annoyed about the fact that you've said the same thing 5 times. So just whether that's like your spouse, like for me, that was my husband, but whether it's like your best friend or your parent or something, or a sibling, just find that person who that you can kind of just unleash all of that MBA energy on when you need to. I think that's a very important part of it.
We need some applause. We need some applause for your spouse there.
Yes, exactly. He definitely earned it. And actually, kind of a fun fact, I was so nervous in this process, I didn't tell anybody else that I was applying. Like, I didn't tell my friends and family, which is something that's really unusual. Yeah. So he really got all of my energy in this process. So double applause for him.
Is there a reason why you didn't want to tell them? The rest of your family or friends, colleagues? It's interesting,
Yeah, and that's something that I think is a lot different, because I know a lot of people kind of go in this process and it's a whole group thing of, everybody reads my essays and kind of offers me help and stuff like that. For me, I just was taking a pretty big leap, and I was really nervous that it wouldn't work out. And if that happened, I just didn't want to have to deal with the pressure of all of my family and friends kind of knowing that as well, of like, oh, wow, you're applying to business school. That's so exciting. That's so great, and we're so happy for you. But then it's 6 months later and it turns out that I didn't get in or something like that. I just was kind of putting that pressure on myself, and I didn't want to have kind of the external pressure, especially because I really didn't find throughout this process somebody who had a similar profile to mine. So I was just kind of hitting submit and seeing what happened. After I hit submit, I did end up telling my friends and family. I was originally like, I'll just tell them when I get in. But after I hit submit, I was feeling pretty nervous about all my applications, and I did kind of fess up of like, hey, I've kind of been working on this thing for a while, and I want you guys to know I'm hoping that it'll work out.
Yeah. Wow.
But another piece of advice that I would say for staying sane, probably my number one piece of advice, period, if you are just somebody who suffers from anxiety or self-doubt, especially in this process, is just be careful what you read. Like,
let's talk about that.
If you are somebody who is going to go on Poets and Quants and read the dang reports where they tell like people why they got rejected, and that's going to make you feel terrible about yourself, just don't do it. Just stop doing it. Or if you like read something of like, oh, let's introduce the best and brightest, Wharton class of 2020, and all of those profiles are so intimidating to you and you find yourself comparing yourself to those people, like, just stop doing it. Because I started reading those things kind of early on, and at first it was kind of helpful just to hear about the students or about the consultants who maybe were evaluating profiles that got rejected and stuff. But then I just got to a point where I realized it would just make me second guess myself, and it would just, give me more anxiety. It would make me feel nervous of like, oh my goodness, this person who went to Yale and got, a 770 didn't get in. How am I going to get in? And I just realized it wasn't like helping me. It wasn't giving me anything. It was only making me doubt myself. And so if you are somebody who suffers from that too, like, you're doing yourself a favor by just avoiding it and just being more tactful with what you read and only reading things that you feel like are actually going to help you on this journey as opposed to holding you back.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, funny story about that though. I thought that the whole time, But after I got my HBS interview invite, which as a lot of people know is kind of the harder thing, like once you get your interview, you have about a 50-50 shot, a little bit better than that of actually getting in, but they cut most people in the interview. Like most people just don't get an interview. And so once I got my interview, I was like, oh my God, I'm feeling so great. I'm so excited, all that sort of thing. And then they came out with the Ding report for that same round. So it was the profiles of all of the people that Harvard had just rejected when they accepted me. And I was feeling so good. I was like, oh, that's fine. I can read that. It'll be okay. Like now that I have my interview, I feel so much more confident. Worst decision ever. I was reading through it and I was like, oh my goodness, they made a mistake. Why would they reject this person and let me in? Like, why did they do that? This is so crazy that this person has such an amazing profile. So learn from my mistake. Just don't do it.
Okay, I want to talk about this further because I think you bring up, it's such a common thing and it's so hard. You're in this psychologically fragile state, right? Like you said, I mean, this journey for you has been about taking this leap of faith, like that you can do this despite your background in different ways, right? And you're reading these Ding reports, you're coming to a site like ours and we're like, okay, we think these are probably stretch schools for you, right? Basically what I'm trying to get at is how can you balance getting an idea of how the outside world would see you without psyching yourself out, right? Because you need both. You need to be strong in your case and your confidence and like what you can offer a school, but also give yourself the best chance. Let's put it that way, right? Of getting into the schools you're applying. So I'm not even sure if there's an answer there, but I think it's a core issue, conflict that all applicants have. So hard.
And I think that like kind of getting the more critical part, whether that is, reading Ding reports or like I said, submitting my profile to Touch MBA, like doing those things like earlier is probably more helpful because it does give you more of that perspective. But I just realized once I got to the point that I was like, okay, I know the strategy that I'm going to take in my applications. I know a little bit more about these schools and what I need to know in the research part and stuff. Like once I got to that point, I just knew that there wasn't really anything else that like those things were going to give me. Yeah. So it's like kind of go through those parts earlier on because I think it does help you understand like, okay, maybe how am I going to be viewed? How are other people who got rejected? How are they reviewed? Like how does all of this kind of work? But yeah, once you're further down and you have solidified your resume or an essay or two and you really know like kind of what you're going for in your applications, then like that's the point that I think you should probably shut that off because there's not really much to be gained from it. And something I also realized when you read things like that is just understand that like your profile is not your application. There's a reason that when you're submitting an application, they're not just looking at the things that are in your profile. They're not just looking at that quick hit, 6 data points and making a decision. So just because somebody has a really strong profile, like maybe they didn't execute correctly on their application. And that's, that's not to say that makes them any less valuable of a candidate, but just maybe the admissions committee couldn't see their story as clearly because of that, So just understand that it's like, yeah, maybe your profile is different than somebody else, but so much of it has to do with the way you do utilize all of that space in the application that exists outside of, those 6 data points.
I think that's such great advice in like terms of getting the outside view, outside eyes on your profile early on to kind of see, okay, maybe I can bolster this or that, or like communicate this stronger here or that stronger there. We try our best. I have to kind of defend our service a little bit. Like we try our best, like, to give people an indication. Obviously we can't see all parts of you, right? From a resume, but we try. But yeah, exactly. We can't see your entire application, right? There's so much more to you. And I hope we make that clear in our communication, but
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously there wasn't any like hard feelings or I wouldn't be here right now. But of course that, like I said, it's like people, if I had sent my profile to anywhere else, I would have gotten the same result, I'm sure. It's like the schools that I went to, my 2 undergrad schools were like 80% acceptance rate state schools. I work for a Midwest healthcare IT company that's not well known. I'm a UX designer, which they're not, admissions committees don't know too much about. Just looking at those facts, it's really easy to say like, yeah, no, this doesn't really make sense why would you apply to Harvard?
Yeah. Well, I love that you shared the story of why you did apply to Harvard and how you got in. And one last question I have I have 2 more. Is there anything else that I missed you've heard a lot of our podcasts. So like, what else needs to be communicated here? What else should applicants know?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, we didn't really talk about the GMAT too much, which you do have this one podcast. I don't remember which one, but you talk with some different admissions committee members about the fact that like where you're from, like your nationality does affect like the way they view your GMAT score, which it was like, oh, that's really refreshing to hear like from, their mouths themselves that that's the case. That was something that was just really helpful to know. But yeah, I know a lot of people say to get the GMAT out of the way early, which you should, but if you don't, because you hear that so often, don't fret, because I was also doing the GMAT while I was doing my applications and stuff. Yeah, and so, ideally you can get it done earlier, but if you're having to do it at the same time that you're working on your applications, it is possible. And so I also think that getting your numbers a little bit more in line with your target schools when you do have an unconventional background is probably a little bit more important, because if they don't know much about the college you went to and they don't know much about the place you work, then they don't really have anything to draw upon as far as your academic performance other than your GPA and your GMAT. So I ended up taking the GMAT 3 times and raised it each time, because I knew that was something that was going to be really important, is making sure that that wasn't going to be the reason that I didn't get in, because that's something that's a little bit easier to fix, is just like, okay, let's make sure that that I can succeed in this program. So dedicating time to that. And obviously I didn't use private GMAT tutors or anything like that, so
yeah, it's a lot of self-study, a lot of your son giving you encouragement while he's coloring.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, did you take any other steps to show your quantitative skills aside from the bolstering that GMAT one score at a time?
No, I mean, I did not luck out, but I mean, I did happen to, for my undergrad, for my second one that I went to, Missouri University of Science Technology, even though it's not a super selective school, it is an engineering school. And my degree there, since it was science and business, so I had some calculus classes, some financial accounting classes and stuff like that. So that I think probably
and you
also
performed well,
helped my background.
Yeah.
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 You
got
as
good
far
grades.
as that, I was like, yeah, my GPA was like pretty much dead average for Harvard, but it's like I'm sure that maybe wasn't viewed as well as if somebody who got that same GPA at Princeton or something like that. But did well enough.
Yeah, did well enough. Clearly. Okay, so my last question. Thank you so much, by the way, for sharing so openly, what you did and your strategy and how you made the most out of all your applications and what a crazy application process this has been for you. But my last question is, as a UX designer, how would you design the application process to be more efficient?
Oh, that's a good question. I would make sure that the HBS application would stop timing out, because it did that a few times and I lost my progress.
Oh my gosh.
Which, I mean, it was just for the smaller text fields and stuff, but it was like, dang it, I really liked the way I was phrasing that. And then I click next and it had timed out. So that would be one thing. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I like it whenever schools are a little bit more creative with what they do. And I feel like each school kind of has their own way of doing that. Like, obviously, just based off the questions you were asking, which was, MIT kind of has you do video versus, a case study in your interview and stuff like that.
NYU does the Pick Six, right? Pick Six things.
Yeah. Which that I was like really able to take advantage of with having a design background, But, I think something that was part of like why I was drawn to Harvard and something they do right in their application process that I think a lot of schools don't think about when they're designing the application itself is it's very conversational. This is already like a process that is so wrought with anxiety and things like that. And, that you are already just feeling a little bit intimidated by these institutions. And, even just the way you phrase things in the application can ease that. And so, for instance, like, I think it's like the additional essay or something for the HBS application form. It even says like, hey, we know you'll be tempted to put in an extra essay or an extra something here, but, we want to keep it fair. So just make sure you don't, like something like that just sounds like you're talking to me. It just sounds like it's very lighthearted. It sounds a lot better than like, do not, all caps, like, place any additional information here, as this will, be viewed as a breach of, like just the way that you actually convey those things, and even just all across your admissions website, it makes a really big difference when you're talking about your policies and things like that, to just sound like you're a human being talking to another human being. And it just makes the school seem more open and more receptive, rather than it just feeling like you're talking to, like the written policy or a robot or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, and you mentioned another case of that before your HBS interview, how they had someone kind of walk you up there and kind of, in a sense, hold your hand right through that process and be like, basically, we know this is really intimidating, but just remember to relax. But they did it in a very like human way.
Yeah, exactly. I think that NYU and HBS both were really good about that throughout the process of thinking more of like, okay, how can we treat you as a person and get to know you as a person first, and like just some of those different steps, and, whether that be different organizations like emailing you after you get your interview and offering to help, or whatever the case may be. I just think that both of those schools stood out to me, and that they did so many of those things that like really you can tell that they're looking at the end-to-end experience, and looking at all of the different touch points that you have with that school, and that they're trying to make each of those touch points good. And I think other schools, it's not that they're not trying to do that. I think it's just that it's more of a like, oh, here's our admission criteria. We just put the admissions criteria in a form, and then you fill it out, and then we'll look at it. And it's just kind of a little bit more robotic, as opposed to thinking of like, oh, how can we use every step of this to make you feel comfortable and to make you want to come here?
Right. Make you want to come here, make you feel comfortable, and both those things will help you express yourself more fully, right, as an applicant.
Yeah, exactly. It'll make you more comfortable being an authentic person, because we are doing our best to be authentic back.
Yeah. I can't agree with you more. I mean, it's obviously harder to do than to say, but I hate it when schools are like, just be yourself, be authentic. I think that and it's a holistic admissions process are like the two things that just drive me crazy, and were honestly like a big reason why I started the show, right? Is I'm like, come on, let's get real with this stuff. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably make some sort of like drinking game out of every time like somebody at admissions was asked something, and it was like, well, it's a holistic admissions process. And I get it. I mean, I know that it is, but it's like there is still more to it. There is still some things that are viewed differently. Like I said, I think that podcast you did where it was talking about the GMAT scores and those being viewed differently, like that's super helpful information that you don't ordinarily hear. That's something that's really good to know when you are hitting submit.
Yeah, I mean, they have to say it. Like they have to, because there's always exceptions, and so they can't, like they have their hands tied behind their back, basically, So I can't blame them, but I just wish that there was another way to give more relatable or more, better info. So Grace, this has been wonderful. We went way over time, but I think, I hope every minute of this I know it will be useful to listeners. So thank you so much. I hope we can stay in touch through this process. I'd love to get you back on the show a year later or 2 years later. I really have fun kind of tracking, people and see how they change through the whole process. And
oh yeah, I'm definitely open to it. And yeah, no, I know we've got over time, but I've really enjoyed, being able to share this information, like not only because you spend so many months learning all of this, only to as soon as you get accepted have it all be useless, which don't get me wrong, it's good that it is, because I'm happy that, the journey is over, because it is pretty stressful, but I'm glad that I'm getting an outlet to at least share that with other people. And I just really hope that if anybody is listening who kind of is worried in the same place that I was 6 months ago of like, I don't know if I found another person like me in business school, or I don't know if this is the right path, but I just feel like it is. And I feel like if I get there, I can make a difference. I hope this does provide a little bit of solace, and hopefully lets that person know to keep trying, because it can work out.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way to end this episode. Thank you so much.